going to start a new series this month called Foundation Truths. Every once in a while, there's these moments when you kind of begin to identify and you begin to stop in and go, I understand what someone was saying. Sometimes I feel like I can identify with Pilate. Pilate, the Roman governor who was in charge of Jerusalem during the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, he was the one who kind of interrogated Jesus, and as he's interrogating him, he's trying to figure out what did he do. The Jewish council had handed him over to Rome to be crucified. They were by law not supposed to crucify people because it was not under Jewish control, and so the Jewish council handed him over to the Roman to be put to death. And so Pilate is there saying, what have you done that was deserving of death? And he begins to question him. And the charge that the Jewish leaders had given to Jesus that said you need to put him to death, the charge was this. He is claiming to be king. He's trying to usurp Rome's authority. And so as Pilate is sitting there questioning him, he begins and he starts by saying this. Are you a king? Are you claiming to be king? Now, Jesus doesn't directly answer. Instead, he answers in a strange way, and he says this in John chapter 18, verse 37. He goes, you say that I am king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth recognize that what I say is truth. And Pilate responds with this interesting thing, and he says this, what is truth? Have you ever had a conversation with someone as you're discussing an event, you're discussing a situation, you're discussing a thought, and you're talking about this, but it comes very clearly after a while that though you may be talking about the same thing, you do not see things at all the same. And you walk away from that conversation thinking, how can someone not see the truth? The interesting thing is that other person walks away from that same conversation going, how can that person not see the truth? For example, I'll kind of help you understand what I'm talking about. Over the last couple years, you've heard my kind of obsession over coffee. And so over the years, these last couple years, starting during the pandemic years, I bought a quality coffee machine. It's pretty cool. I went a step farther and I bought a quality coffee grinder. That means now I go out and I buy fresh ground whole beans and I begin to grind my beans up. And so if you begin to talk to me about coffee and stuff, I might begin to talk to you about trying to find the nuances of the brown sugar and molasses that's found in my coffee. I can tell you guys are like enthralled already. And the point is as I'm talking to you, you're looking at me going, James, you're a little bit strange. You see, when I get up in the morning and I want a cup of coffee, you know what I want? I want something that is just strong, dark, bitter, and gives you a good kick in the pants to get out the door. If I want to taste brown sugar and molasses in my coffee, guess what I'm going to put in my coffee? And as you walk away from that conversation, you look at me and you begin to go, what a poor soul he is. He has lost the plot. I don't get where he's coming from. And I walk away from that conversation going, what a poor soul he is. He's got no idea of what greatness coffee can be. Sometimes we can be talking about the exact same things and we can begin to look at it from two totally different perspectives and come up with two totally different answers, can't we? I've come to understand that in life we have moments when we don't always see things from the same point of view. And you know what? There are times when you may be right. There are differences of perspectives. There are different ways of seeing an outcome. You may be right. To you, chocolate ice cream may be the best ice cream there is, and I will still look at you and disagree and say vanilla is still the best. Because if I want chocolate ice cream, I can then put chocolate on my ice cream. Or if I want strawberry ice, I'll put strawberries on my ice cream. So vanilla's got to be the best. And we can have different perspectives. Yet at the same time, when it comes to following Jesus Christ, there must be some absolute truths that we all agree on. Over the years, one of the main arguments that I continually come up against is when you begin to try to share your faith. I have heard this so many times when someone will say, James, there are how many different denominations in the world today? And by the way, if you're curious, it is estimated that there are over 45,000 different Christian denominations. Okay, that's just denominations. That's not going off into the sub-branches of... Okay, does that begin to make your mind blow just a little bit? Pastor, James, there are over 45,000, and they don't usually mention 45,000. They just say there are so many different Christian denominations today in the world, and none of them can agree on what the Bible says. Therefore, what is the conclusion? If Christians cannot agree what God says, therefore it doesn't really matter what God says. Have you ever come up against that argument? Maybe you're sitting there this morning and you didn't hear someone else say it, but maybe you've thought it yourself. Maybe in the back of your mind you've sat there and wondered, I don't get it. There's so many different Christians out there, so many people who claim to follow Jesus Christ, and they believe all these different things. But I'm going to start this morning, and I'm going to say this. As followers of Jesus Christ, there must be some absolute truths that we all agree on in order to be followers of Jesus Christ. So over these next few weeks, we're going to look at these foundational truths that we must agree on that says to be a follower of Jesus Christ, these are so vitally important. At the same time, we're going to say there's some disagreements we are allowed to have that don't count as much as some of the others. In Amos chapter 3, verse 3, Amos was a minor prophet of the old Jewish kingdom when Israel split apart into two kingdoms, Judah and Israel. Amos was a farmer who was not born a prophet, but God called him with a message to the other kingdom. And he began to call out the corruption of those who were wealthy. And as he began to call them out, he begins to stop and he says something, and he looks at him and says, you claim to be followers of God, yet you're going in a different direction than what he called you. And he says this, can two people walk together without agreeing on a common direction? In spite of all of our differences, in spite of all of the denominations that are out there, there must be some foundational truths that we must all agree on. There are some facts that we will probably always disagree on, but when it comes to following Jesus Christ, there must be some facts that are absolute. So, Over the next few weeks, we're going to start with them, and I'm going to start from a place that we would all probably agree on. The first foundational truth that we must have, that must be absolute, is so basic that you're going to look at me and say, James, does it matter? And we're going to say, yes, this matters so much. And that is the foundational truth that God is. I think we can all probably agree on that this morning. As we're sitting in service, we're looking around saying, well, why else would we be here? But this foundational truth has got to be a foundation upon which everything else is built. The interesting thing is that as we begin to read the Bible, the Bible never tries to prove the existence of God. There is no argument to prove that God exists. In fact, it simply starts from an assumption that most of us have in our lives from the very start, and that there must be a God. In fact, in Genesis 1:1, it starts with this very simple phrase, in the beginning, God. It starts with an assumption that God is. In fact, it doesn't just start with the assumption. In fact, later on, David begins to tell us that you don't need much to tell you God exists. In fact, David goes on to tell us that as we look around, our very minds go, God must be because of what I see. In other words, David says this, the heavens proclaim the glory of God, the sky displays his craftsmanship. You ever got out at night and just began looking up at the stars? I got to be honest with you. I'm one of these guys who I have been watching the Boeing as they're trying to get their spaceship up off the ground. I'm always interested in watching what SpaceX is doing and Virgin Galactic. I just find it fascinating. But David looks at us and he says, every time you look up at the sky and you see the stars at night in all of its bounty, it begins to make you feel a little bit small, doesn't it? We're merely dust on a speck of a dust that floats in the realm of dust. It's this amazing thing. And in fact, David begins to say, as you begin to look up and you begin to understand what we are around here, and just the sheer amazing, your mind goes, wow, there must be something bigger out there. Paul goes on to describe it, and he doesn't just say as we look up and we look around us. He doesn't just say as you look around society, and in fact, we know that the more we look at life, the more complicated it is, the more we say, there must be something because it is too intricate, it's too designed, it's too amazing. Paul goes one step farther and he says this, they know the truth about God because he made it obvious to them. For ever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and sky through everything God has made. They can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power, and divine nature. Paul pushes us to a point that says, not only do we stop and see and understand there must be a God by what is, but if we just look at it, we can begin to understand his character and his nature. The idea that God is must say that God is more than just a feeling. God is more than just a force that floats around. God has got to be more than just a moral construct. There must be a God that is a personal being who exists. All right. It's an interesting place to start. God is. if we're going to become a follower of Jesus Christ, if we're going to have faith today that matters, we must start from a point of view that we can all agree with. And that point of view starts with a simple idea that there is a God. But why does it matter? Does it matter? Does the very fact that there is a God, I mean, we live in a society that says, hey, I'm agnostic. I don't know if there's a God, and I don't really care if there's God. If there is, that's good. If there's not, that's good. Is there really such a thing as someone who is agnostic? There either is, we either think there is, or we think there is not. And does it matter? I mean, I've got to be honest with you. Some of the nicest people that I've met, some of the good, moral people that I have met have been atheists. Does it matter that someone believes that God is or that God is not? Does it really matter? Well, yes, it does. And here's where we're going to begin to start. If God is, then it implies that he is the standard, right? So we're going to go, I don't know, do we call this philosophy this morning, where we begin to say, if God is, it implies the fact he is the ultimate standard? If his eternal power and nature is seen through creation, if his invisible attributes are evident to us, we're saying, well, then obviously he must be the standard of all that is good and right. Paul began to try to tease out this argument when he began to write the letter to the Corinthian church. Now, just to kind of let you in on a little secret, the Corinthian church was probably I don't know why that made me about jump out of my little stool right here. But Paul began to write a letter to the Corinthian church. The Corinthian church was a church that we would look at it and we would say, whoa, you're calling that a church? They had so many problems. In fact, the church was so messed up that as Paul is writing to them, he's saying this: you guys are a church, but what you're doing, you say you are followers of God, but at the same time, the things that you are doing, even those who would have no claim to God wouldn't do these things. The things that you find that I'm talking to you about, you wouldn't find these things written in the tabloid magazine at your local grocery store. And so Paul begins to call them out, and he begins to challenge them on this idea. In fact, he begins to stop, and as he's pulling them out, he begins to challenge them with this idea a little bit, and he begins to say this: for God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sins, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. Paul's beginning to tease out this idea that there is a God who is above all, who is the standard above all. John, one of Jesus' first 12 disciples, began to write the churches around Ephesus, and he begins to remind them of this idea. God is light, and there is no darkness in him at all. In other words, there is a standard that says if God is God, he must be the absolute standard of what is. And I think all of us could sit this morning and say, well, yeah, that may be true. But I want to stop and just think about this just a little bit more. Because as we begin to talk about God being the standard, it's not just that he's telling us what the standard is. He's not just saying, Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not bear false witness. He doesn't just stop and give us a list of rules, but he becomes the one who is. Now, what do I mean by that? So we say this. Anyone ever heard this? God is, and we can put a blank on it, God is truth. Well, what do we mean by that? Are we just saying God tells the truth? Well, we kind of, but it goes beyond that. It means the very idea that if God is, then God is truth. He is incapable of lying because it is incompatible with his nature. God is truth. We say God is love. Not just that God loves us, but that the very act of who he is by being God says that he is the standard of what love is. He is love. He can do nothing but love, because if God hated, he could not be God. In other words, it's like having a pure white sheet of paper in front of us with no black dots on it at all. Even the tiniest speck of a black dot would mean it is not a pure white piece of paper. It is flawed. When we begin to talk about God and God being the standard, it's not just that he is a pretty good, clean piece of paper. He is the ultimate white piece of paper that is our standard. Okay. Are we lost yet? Okay. Just bear with me. This really matters. This is a foundational truth that if we're going to be a follower of Jesus Christ, we must begin to hold to these standards, because if God is, and if he is our standard, then we are called to be like what? Our standard must be him. He has the right to declare what the standard is because he is. I know. Hey, Pastor, this goes to some other class. Hold with me. This is really important. And it's really important for you to understand, because if God is our standard, then he is the standard that we are held to. In Romans chapter 3, Paul makes this statement to the Roman church. And he says this: "For everyone has sinned, we all fall short of God's glorious standard." In other words, there is a standard that we're all held to. The standard is not your neighbor, no matter how nice they are, or no matter how nasty they are. Because, isn't that what we do? We go, well, at least I'm better than. Look, I may not be, but at least I'm better than. Paul reminds us of a very interesting fact, and he says, that neighbor is not your standard. Your spouse, no matter how perfect they are, is not your standard. Your pastor is not your standard. As I sit before you this morning, I want to say this. I really desire to live a life that you guys can emulate. I want to stop, and I want to live a life that when you look at me, you go, hey, I may not always agree with him, but I at least want to act like that. That's my desire. But can I be honest with you? Is the standard that I have set for my own life is not the standard for your life. The standard that we all measure ourselves to is not the greatest person we can think of. It's not Mother Teresa. It's God. And Paul pulls us to this idea that says, We all sin because we fall short of God's glorious standard. You see, what Paul is saying is he's not saying that we all sin because we all do bad, ugly things. You see, when we talk about sin, we have this picture and this notion in our mind of that which is awful, broken, messed up. If I was to talk to you this morning and I would say, are you a sinner? Automatically the first thing that comes to your mind is you're saying, I've never robbed a bank. I've never lied on my taxes. I've never, and we begin to go through and we have this picture of what sin is. Paul is telling us that sin is not this dark, ugly matter. Sin is the idea of missing God's glorious standard. It's having an almost pure white piece of paper and having a dot on it. It's just a small dot. Not that big of a dot. It's just a little dot. And God is saying, I am the standard. And my standard is a pure white piece of paper. Anything that does not hit the mark of God is sin. What an interesting picture. So, we're going to start this morning, and by the way, you guys got a privilege because of no music. You're going to get out a few minutes early. You can beat everyone else to the restaurant downtown, and you can go, woohoo, if you'd only come to church with me, you could have been here too, but as we begin this series, we must hold to the idea there must be some foundational truths that we must all agree on. They're not, well, you see it your way and I'll see it my way. And by the way, there are some truths that we go, I'm not sure, I think, and we do what we know, what we think is right. But there's some truths that must be absolute. And it must start on a foundation that God is. And if God is, then He is what we measure our lives to. That's important. Without this basic foundation, let me just talk to you real quick. We're about to close. But without this basic foundation of God is, where do we go? Who is the standard if there is no God? I'm just let that sink in just for a moment. Who becomes the standard if there is no God? Who becomes the white piece of paper that we must measure our life against? Is it the government? I know the government always wants the best for us. Okay, I be careful say how I say that. Is it the pastor? Well, it doesn't really matter what he says because if there is no God, whatever he says is worthless. Is it your spouse? And don't take this the wrong way, but which spouse is it? Our first, our second, our third? Is it you? Are you the standard? You see, the problem is that the moment we begin to try to erase God out of our lives is the moment we begin to say that there is no standard and anyone's standard is a reality and everyone's standard becomes a place of legitimacy. And we know that cannot be true, because the reality is if that is true, then we have no right to lock someone up in prison for doing something that is wrong. Why do I say that? Because there ultimately is no wrong. You just have a different reality. What is right? What is wrong? We must come with a basic foundational truth that as we come to live our lives as followers of Jesus Christ, it must start at a basic concept, and it's one that we all agree with to start with, and that is God is. And He is our standard we measure to. I want to encourage you, come back next week for part 2, foundational truths we must stand on.